Hello, my name is Stephen Denman. My organisation is Shining Guidance. My website is shiningguidance.com. I'm going to talk to you today about two seemingly unrelated subject areas which are actually very interlinked, very complementary, and very related. One is egocentric and egocentric thinking, specifically in men, and how that interlinks with ceremonial magic or sexual ritual magic and the darker aspects of Western occultism and Eastern occultism. And for the purposes of this presentation, I will be naming certain numbers of individuals that fully exemplify the points I'm making in this talk. And the first individual, who I'm sure all of you have heard of, and is an individual by the name of Edward Alexander Crowley. He became better known as Aleister Crowley, the occultist and ceremonial magician who founded the religion of Thelema, who also studied English literature at Trinity College in Cambridge. He completely rejected his strict Christian upbringing from his parents. He became largely agnostic, but was quite happy to start believing in the existence of vast numbers of demons or negative entities or astral entities that reside in the lower astral and therefore the infernal regions beyond linear space-time. Now, a friend of Aleister Crowley's was the famous chemist and occultist known as George Cecil Jones Jr., and with Aleister Crowley, they founded the interesting and very intriguing magical organisation called the Argenteum Astrum, which translates from the Latin language to the English language as Silver Star. Now, there's various connections between the Argenteum Astrum or Silver Star and the Sirius A system, which is located in the Canis Major constellation. Perhaps that's a talk for another day I could do. Another individual who was very famous in his own right and very centred on egocentric thinking and control through subversive methods was the occultist and ceremonial magician who founded the beginnings of chaos magic, and his name was Austin Osman Spare. Another individual who was a very famous ceremonial magician who was an intensely passionate advocate for the religion of Thelema that Aleister Crowley and George Cecil Jr. Jones practiced was the individual known as Kenneth Grant. Then we have the American, who was a very famous rocket scientist and ceremonial magician by the name of Marvell Whiteside Parsons, who became known as John Whiteside Parsons, that many of you will more commonly know as Jack Parsons. Now, he was again another passionate advocate of the religion of Thelema. He also helped to develop the foundings of what became known as the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, at the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, or NASA. He also founded the Agape Lodge. Now, we know that the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, can trace its origins back to 1936 to the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory, or the GAL, that was based at the California Institute of Technology, where the first set of rocket experiments were carried out in the Arroyo Seco. We also know that Jack Parsons, while he was studying there, was involved in occultic practices. He was obsessed with summoning demons or negative entities or astral entities from the astral plane and therefore from beyond linear space-time. So he was involved in some very dark, obsessive practices and was fascinated by the idea of controlling these supernatural forces. Again, more egocentric gratification. Again, he was fully unconscious, even though Jack Parsons was an immensely intelligent individual. There were many graduate students who didn't involve themselves in any of these occult practices that graduated from the California Institute of Technology, who were involved in similar research programs to Jack Parsons. One individual was Frank Joseph Molina, another individual was Weld Arnold, and another individual was Apollo Milton Olin Smith. And they were all good friends of Jack Parsons, and they were fully aware that he was involved in using ceremonial magic and sexual ritual magic and the darker aspects of Western occultism and Eastern occultism. So the subject of egoic thinking and the egocentric gratification and how that interplays with ceremonial magic and sexual ritual magic and the darker aspects of Western occultism and Eastern occultism is very evident. And we know that beyond linear space-time, many of these demons or negative entities or astral entities are themselves obsessed with gaining access to human consciousness and human emotions because it gives them greater control and inceptive dominance, from the astral plane into the 3D holographic reality of this material dimension. And this is especially the case with the secret society networks, with the higher degrees of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. It's the case with the system of the elites, or the hidden hand of the cabal on this planet. And you can look back and say, well, what was Aleister Crowley really up to? Why was he so furiously obsessed and intensely, fixated on ceremonial magic and sexual ritual magic and the darker aspects of Western occultism and Eastern occultism? What was in it for him? And it comes back to the same pattern of behavioral understanding. It was only based on his own egocentric and egocentric gratification. It didn't matter whether his whole lifestyle was ruined, he was financially impoverished or not. He didn't actually pass on from this world a famous man with vast amounts of wealth, did he? Because what he was really obsessed with was power and dominance beyond linear space-time, not accumulating huge amounts of money while existing as a human being or a Homo sapien, in the 3D holographic reality of this material dimension. So we know that all these men, and were obsessed with that idea. And what was really behind these individuals? What were the, shall we say, the demonic forces, these specific types of negatively based, supernatural forces really after? Why were these men so intellectually receptive to the requirements and the needs of having to use ceremonial magic and sexual ritual magic, Western occultism and Eastern occultism, to achieve a common goal? They were all involved in it. They were all involved in summoning demons or negative entities or astral entities. They had no qualms about doing that. They had no qualms about accessing geomagnetic ley lines and dimensional vortices, using sigils, using runes, using different types of spellcraft. It didn't matter to them. They couldn't care less. Because all of those individuals that I have mentioned were part of the Luciferian consciousness. They only were serving the various demonic overlords in the lower astral plane or the infernal regions, who literally was steering their consciousness, steering their minds, steering them through these occult practices. And we know, for example, that the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, at the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, or NASA, is known to have connections to higher degree Scottish Rite Freemasonry and the different aspects of Western occultism and Eastern occultism, and also including numerology and astrology and various some occultic practices that have been used over many thousands of years, going back way beyond the time of classical Greece, going even back as far into history as ancient Sumer. But we know that there's a lot more that was going on back then that hasn't really been given historical analysis in regards to what these individuals were really up to. So we know that the subject matter itself is very fascinating, is very intriguing. We know that all these individual men, especially Aleister Crowley, really in many ways you could say that he was really one of the ultimate individuals that really paved the way for many other individuals, including paving the way for George Cecil Jones Jr. and Austin Osman Swear, and Kenneth Grant and Marvel Whiteside Parsons, who became better known as John Whiteside Parsons, and most know him as Jack Parsons. All these individuals were really given their kind of conduit, their route through the murky world of ceremonial magic and sexual ritual magic and Western occultism and Eastern occultism, really from the work that was carried out by Edward Alexander Crowley, who became better known as Aleister Crowley. And his religion of Thelema, which he really developed really as an anti-religion against the basis of Christian orthodoxy, was really, if he was alive today, he would probably admit that it was based on Luciferian consciousness, based on acknowledging the existence and trying to get influence and guidance in many ways from demons or negative entities or astral entities in the lower astral and therefore the infernal regions, for what? Monetary gain, for over-sexualizing females that could be used and enslaved to the purposes of the ceremonial magician. It's all very egocentric behavior. It's in many ways quite nihilistic. It's very destructive, the behavior that was going on. It really you have to ask the question, why on earth would these individual men continue to behave this way? And not one of them thought that what they were doing was actually in some way a form of mental illness. Because I actually will look at these individuals now and say, I would say Edward Alexander Crowley, and I would definitely say George Cecil Jones Jr. had severe mental and psychiatric problems that were undiagnosed at the time. You know, medical science was very different, you know, many decades ago anyway. If you go back 70, 80 years ago, it wasn't anywhere near as advanced as it is today. So you had highly mentally unstable individuals involved in various dark practices. And it's ludicrous when you actually think about it, you know, what was going on. And if you take a look at Austin Osman Spare, you know, you've got an individual who became a very famous occultist and ceremonial magician in his own right. He finds that he has developed a unique ritualistic system that became known as chaos magic. Now, chaos magic, many of the runes and the sigils used in chaos magic are clearly designed to open up dimensional portals. They are sigils that are supposed to affect specific frequencies, vibrations, and energetics that allow a linear space-time shift that will open these various dimensional portals from the lower astral and therefore the infernal regions to allow these demonic overlords to come through. I suppose in the mind of Austin Osman Spare, the whole reason for that was really because he thought that they would be encountering him, would recognise his brilliance, his own egocentric gratification would be met, and they would give him tremendous potency and powers beyond his wildest imagination to sort of rule over human beings or Homo sapiens on planet Earth. And the same thing with Kenneth Grant, of course, who became utterly obsessed with the religion of Thelema that Edward Alexander Crowley had developed. You know, and you have to ask also, why were they kind of developing all these kinds of occultic religions, and why were they developing, for example, these bizarre and unusual magical organizations? What was the purpose behind the Argentium, Astrum or Silver Star? What was the actual real ultimate end goal of developing these organizations? Because many of them were set up, I've just given a small example, you know, and if you're going to create a religion called Thelema, which was really about ritualizing demonic possession, it's the summoning of entities, the summoning of literally astral spirits from beyond linear space-time. You've got to really ask the question: what driving force in these men was really there? They had mental health issues. They were being literally exploited themselves on a psychological level by these forces beyond linear space-time, and I find it very disturbing that so much has been given to these individuals. And you find that the hidden hand, the secret society networks, you know, you can say what you want, whatever name you want to give them, the higher degree Scottish Rite Freemasons, a lot of these individuals were given a lot of funding. I mean, Edward Alexander Crowley was given a lot of funding, you know, and so was George Cecil Jones Jr. Austin Osman Spare was given funding. Kenneth Grant was given funding. Marvel, you know, Whiteside Parsons, who became known as John Whiteside Parsons and commonly known as Jack Parsons, you know, wasn't just a rocket scientist and a ceremonial magician that helped to found the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL. He was given a lot of funding behind the scenes to do research into ceremonial magic and sexual ritual magic. He wasn't just some sort of you know, estranged outsider that just sort of came out of nowhere, came left field into the picture. So it's always the hidden hand. It's always going back to the elites and the cabal behind the scenes that are involved in these nefarious practices and test bedding by using and exploiting these individuals who themselves have mental health problems, psychiatric issues, and also are obsessed with their own egos. They're obsessed with gaining control, obsessed with dominance over supernatural forces, obsessed with trying to gain control even over the cycles of weather and Mother Nature, to gain influence over human emotions. And obviously, you know, any individual male who is a ceremonial magician, or you know, is using different dark practices, is probably going to be very, very interested in gaining sexual types of control over females by using ceremonial magic, you know, as a way of influencing their thoughts and gaining control over their thoughts, so they can do things with them that they wouldn't normally be able to do in a conventional sense, say in a monogamous, relationship. There's fidelity, marital loyalty, and proper divinely based lovemaking going on. Because sexual ritual magic is really based on various degrading, sexualized forms of ritualism, which subjugate the individual who's involved by the ceremonial magician is gaining powers and potency and influence from controlling their life force, from controlling their auras, and actually just imprinting more trauma and stress on those individuals. So yeah, I thought it was really important to discuss this. It's something that I don't see other people discussing, is the psychological aspects of why so many of these people, whether it's Edward Alexander Crowley, whether it is George Cecil Jones Jr. or Austin Osman Spare or Kenneth Grant or Jack Parsons or anybody else, and there's many others. I mean, I could list many, many more, but this presentation would end up being a lot bigger than it is already. And you have to ask, what has really been achieved in the last 50, 60, 70 years by all this so-called knowledge and the development of the religion of Thelema and the development of the Argentian Astral Silver Star? What does that magical organisation do to benefit humanity? What does it do to benefit impoverished men and women, vulnerable people, people with physical and mental impairments, vulnerable children, vulnerable adults, elderly individuals? What does it do to benefit them, the common man? It doesn't do anything. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't actually give anything back at all, because how can egocentric gratification, that's always based on the self, is based on nothing else but the self and only the self, and the sense of more of me and mine and nobody else, with a giant snubbing of empathy and compassion and perception and discernment of other human beings and their emotional suffering and their emotional pain. Magic doesn't care for any such things, and that's why ceremonial magic, and therefore sexual ritual magic, and the darker aspects of Western occultism and Eastern occultism are things that people should steer clear of consistently. They are against the divine love of the universal creator of heaven and earth and every eternal parallel dimension, parallel reality and parallel universe forever and ever and ever. They're not there to benefit people. They're there for egocentric gratification of specific individuals who could not care less. And you just take a look at the photographs of people like Edward Alexander Crowley. Look at the photographs of George Cecil Jones Jr. Look at the photographs of Austin Osman Spare. Look at the photographs of Kenneth Grant. Look at a lot of the photographs of Marvell Whiteside Parsons, who became known as John Whiteside Parsons and more commonly known as Jack Parsons, and all the others. They've either got a demonic smirk on their faces, heavily frowning, or they've got a very beady, intense eyes. I mean, they're glaring. Some of the photographs of Crowley are really intense, very intense stares at the camera. He's not a pleasant individual. So you've got some dark energies were going on in the minds of those men. And again, they were given platforms at the time. They were given media platforms to promote what they were doing. There were people photographing them, doing, journals on them, writing up pieces, on what they were involved in. They shouldn't have been given anything. So why were they? I mean, back then, 50, 60 years ago, for example, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, this was a really intensely Christian nation. So why was there all this dark, rebellious evil allowing it to thrive? Really, really, you've got to question what on earth was really going on with these people, And I think when you look at the state of the world today and the mess that this planet is now in, it's in a horrifically bad state. Really a bad way. What did any of these magicians do to help people around them? What did Edward Alexander Crowley do? I mean, I know I've heard some people say he called himself Alexander Crowley and Edward Crowley. I've just basically said that he was commonly known as Edward Crowley, but he was also known as Alexander Crowley by some people. But what is the purpose of what they were doing? What did they achieve? I mean, can you imagine if the whole world was run by ceremonial magicians? All these dysfunctional men with dysfunctional personalities, with severe mental health and psychiatric disorders, who are completely undiagnosed, super intelligent but utterly obsessed with dominating the world, dominating others, dominating everything around them subversively. And it achieved nothing. So that the lesson to be learned from the egocentric gratification of a ceremonial magician is that really what we need is societies to become as compassionate and empathic and as selfless as possible, where millions upon millions of human beings, or Homo sapiens, whatever you want to define a human being as, actually co-creatively work together, cooperate, work in teams, work in communities, work in small societal groups, and for the betterment of each other and the neighbours around them. Can we imagine what kind of world we'd be in if that was going on? We really would be living in the kingdom of heaven upon the planet Earth. And so, regardless of whether you believe in, the Holy Bible and the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or anything else, I'm not going to go into talking about that now. But the truth of the matter is, in an ideal world, if people put aside their own egocentric thinking and the need for any kind of egocentric gratification from any media, from any kind of addiction, from the need to acquire vast amounts of money or to dominate others or to put other people down, to snub the beliefs, the comments, the ideas, and the perspectives of others, and think you're always right and others are always wrong, and to hell with the world, I'm going to do what I damn well please. Well, that's exactly what Edward Alexander Crowley, or Alexander Crowley, or Edward Crowley, that's exactly the way he thought, because he was totally consumed by Luciferian consciousness, because he became a being literally of perpetual incarnate evil. Why would anybody adore or be fascinated by demons or negative entities or astral entities from beyond linear space-time in the astral plane? You'd have to be completely balmy to think like that. No human being could control any demon or negative entity or astral entity in the lower astral or the infernal regions beyond linear space-time, because, you'd have to be such an incredible expert in terms of magical understanding and ritualism of sigils and runes and spellcraft. And I don't think Aleister Crowley had that ability, and I don't think any of the others had that ability either. I think that they aspired to be that, and again, it was all based on egocentric gratification, because they were totally obsessed with themselves and what they were doing. And I think I've presented enough information in this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. It's been fascinating for me to present it. I absolutely love the information that I've conveyed. And there'll be many more videos to come in the very near future. And on that note, folks, I'd like to say take care and goodbye.